Okay, I just wanted to very quickly tell you about the things that have influenced me, my thinking and the thinking of Cheshire to support AT and to support the independent living movement. And I suppose for me, I've worked for Cheshire for 34 years. I walked in the door of the Cara Cheshire home on the 3rd of October 1980 to do an interview. And I was very lucky. The first people I met were two guys called Richard Mooney and Brendan McLaughlin. I'd never seen people with that level of disability, and I turned to walk out, but I remembered I needed the money. I was living on £5 a week at that time, so I needed the job. And I got to know Richard in particular well, and he was one of the first real influencers for me. One of the things that Richard showed me was that the power that that non-disabled support workers or employees or organisations have had over people with disabilities at that stage. And in particular, one of the things I always remember, I can even picture where I was, when Richard told me that he'd had to control going to the loo between the hours of 1 and 2 when staff were at their lunch, and also of understanding the subtlety that when, you know, if you were seen to be, as Richard would have been, a troublemaker, that sometimes that, you know, staff would delay before they came to take you to the loo. Richard sadly died at about 24, 25. He'd written a book in that time, and certainly it influenced me and others, and I certainly want to acknowledge Richard's great teaching. I was lucky enough in about 1983 for Cheshire. I did a research project where I went to Sweden. And on the first day, I was meant to meet a Swedish architect, because in Sweden at that stage, everyone told you that's the place where disability services are the best. And I was in Gothenburg, and I was meant to meet a Swedish architecture lecturer. Fortunately, he couldn't make it, and I met an American who was architect who was had just been asked to meet me. He was, I don't know what you call it, where he was there for about a year. But his wife had a disability, and he told me, he was the first person to tell me about the independent living movement. He told me about the struggles they were having with Gothenburg municipality, who wanted to give him a sort of apartment and 24/7 service, but they wanted the money to operate their own service. And I later found out why. They invited me home for dinner. And they lived in this amazing complex, an apartment and houses. And in the middle of it, there was a square in the middle. There was a huge playground. It was just a playground in the middle. The cars had to park a bit away from where it was. And they had 2 children. And the most important thing that drove their decision was the children's safety and welfare. So they wanted to stay, and they fought and eventually won with Gothenburg municipality to get the money so that they could live in the house that they wanted. It had 2 wooden ramps into the house, and I'd say no OT would have passed it, but it was perfectly fine for them. Unfortunately, I think we all know how professionals can interfere with something that works at times. When I was there as well, 2 other things I always remember. There was one woman who lived in, she had an apartment block. I think there were 86 people with disabilities living in this huge apartment block. And they had 24/7 service, as it was called. And she was, again, seen to be a troublemaker. She'd ring the bell and she'd never know who come. She knew that the staff would plan who was going to come and when, and and so her life, she'd so little control in her life. There was another woman who met her who had been given a wonderful apartment in a place by a lake, and but she told me how she knew that the staff that were coming in were going through her drawers, and that sort of feeling of discomfort, that almost like if someone's house has been robbed, that feeling when people have been through your private possessions. Those sort of things at an early time in my career were just hugely important. Since then, I've been so lucky. I've learned so much from so many, and a lot of the people in the room here. A lot of the people that I've got to know through Cheshire, Hubert McCormick, you mentioned Ursula Hegarty, Eugene, Rosaline MacDonough. There's been a stream of people who've educated me, and people like Martin, who continue to educate me. But one of the things that came so clear to me was, why do these people want and need me in their lives? Why do they need organisations like Cheshire in their lives? They don't. So many of the people, as I think Madeleine said, well capable of organising their lives, none of them were interfering in my life and how I lived my life. So why should I? Or why should the organisation I worked with? One of the other things I always, and it was in the 80s that I came, I totally believed that people had to be their own employers. They had to employ their own staff, because I could see how because of the layer of the organisation and the policies and procedures and the culture of an organisation, how that can impact on the service that people are getting. I think that's one of the huge challenges. I think some people have been saying about the challenges for service providers into the future, and one of the things we have, if we're to survive, and if that's an important thing that we survive or not, we have to be able to deliver the type of support that people want when they want it and at the right sort of cost. And I think that's a challenge for us, but I think it's a challenge that probably most of us are trying to move towards. I just want to one personal thing, because as I said at the outset, I really support everything that AT is doing, and I hope my organisation will, and we have referred a few people to work with Martin and the AT crew. But it is to do with equity and people's participation, is the numbers of people still with disabling conditions who end up in nursing homes still in this state. I was going to raise it earlier with the Minister, but I thought that, no, this is my agenda, not the agenda for today. But I would reckon there are hundreds of people under the age of 65 with disabling conditions who are living far poorer lives than anything we've talked about today. And it is something that I think is a challenge for all of us to try and do something about. I suppose, so that everyone go and get their lunch, I fully support as well, and I will make sure that my organisation does everything it can to support AT and the independent living, because I totally believe it, that as citizens, everyone deserves the right to live in the short life we get, the best possible life. So that's my contribution. Thank you.